My name's Karen Reyes, and today my project is going to be based on trauma in childhood growth. I decided to choose the social and emotional development part of this project as trauma in childhood is actually very common. It's very sad to know this, but it's actually very common in a lot of individuals, and this prevents them from just doing their everyday things as anyone should be able to do. We're going to start off with the introduction for today. Not every child who is born is going to be automatically in a very loving home, which is something that is very sad to listen to even hear about. But this is something that is, as we mentioned, is very common. Multiple individuals are going to be born in a toxic household, and especially at such a young age as we grow. When we're little, we're like little sponges, and whatever we hear around us or whatever's going on around us is really going to affect us. So as time goes, children will be severely affected in their adulthood. So I was doing a little bit of research online, and I figured out that around 34 million children are going to be affected worldwide. This includes multiple countries. Usually it is caused by a situation. Trauma can happen just by one event, two events. It can happen with how many events, but trauma will take place. In 2019, around 13.6 of children have received proper therapy, and I did some calculations, and it ended up being around 4.2 million out of the 34 million individuals who are in this traumatic situation, which is literally nothing at all. So not all the children are getting the proper therapy in order to recover. Moving on, we're going to be talking about what is considered a traumatic experience for a child, because we all have different ways of interpreting what can cause a traumatic experience. When I was doing my research, it was very interesting just learning about all the different things that can be considered traumatic to a child that you might have not even thought about because it just became normal. So I put some bulletin board pins right in front of the screen. So one of them will be bullying. A lot of bullying occurs in school. And, this is something that is always talked about in school, about stopping bullying and all that stuff. And, when I was reading, it made sense how a child might feel like they can't stand up for themselves. They can't do anything. They feel like they have to be quiet. And this continues into their adulthood where they feel powerless. Another experience that can be considered traumatic is parents divorcing. This really takes a huge toll because some children might think it is their fault why their parents don't want to stay together, or why they don't love each other, and this can really take a huge toll on a child. Another one is physical and verbal abuse. Another one is their parents being in a wrong path. This includes drug abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic abuse happening within the family. All of this can really affect the way a child develops, overall in their childhood and in their adulthood. So moving on, what actually causes traumatic events to occur in children's life, I'm going to be touching on some articles about, more about childhood trauma and the effects and all that. So I found this article that I really connected to, as it told me a lot of information, since I'm able to actually connect with some of this due that I did have some childhood trauma in like a long time ago, and this is why I chose this, because I truly connect with there should be more awareness in order for a child to get the proper care in order to not be affected severely. So the article that I found is called What is Childhood Trauma? And it was given by the National Child of Traumatic Stress Network, which is an amazing foundation that helps bring awareness of what exactly this is. So I got a quote from the website, which I think really describes what childhood trauma is. and it reads, "The majority of abused or neglected children have difficulty developing a strong, healthy attachment to a caregiver. Children who do not have healthy attachment have been shown to have a more vulnerable to stress. They have trouble controlling and expressing emotions and may react violently and inappropriate to situations." So furthermore to this, as I kept continuing to read, they spoke about how not only does it mentally affect a child, but also physically. Because when a child grows up afraid and under a lot of constant stress, their immune system and body stress response systems are not going to be normal. They're going to have symptoms as rapid breathing and their heart pounding, or even shutting down, as when they come to situations that are stressful to them, their body just completely just blanks out and they just don't know how to respond or react. And as mentioned, they can actually, physically get sick, as if the body, shuts down, if something's not working, it could cause them to get sick. Going on to the emotional part, this can cause depression, anxiety, or anger to build up and eventually just occur. Their emotional response is going to be unpredictable or explosive, as it can create bipolarness within a child, which goes into adulthood. Another one that I could really connect to was dissociation. It is something that occurs to me to this day due to events that occurred in the past. And this situation occurs when, a trauma happens and a child might just cut off and lose touch of themselves, and they just totally blank out and just are like basically in a whole different world, which is something that is very scary. So behavior wise, anything could basically, trigger a child if they have something traumatic that happened in their life. They're just like a ticking bomb ready to explode, full of emotion, full of anger, and just anxiety that also is really, really impacting them severely. So this article, it was so nice reading it, as it had a lot of information about what childhood trauma is and the effects it brings emotionally, physically, and in general, the overall life and how this goes into adulthood, which we'll be touching upon in this next article. The next article that I chose is called 4 Ways Childhood Trauma Can Affect Adults. So I chose this quote that I think just overall matched the article and summarized it the best it could. So it says, "If you were neglected as a child or abandoned by your caretaker, you may have buried your anger and in hope that it will mean no one will ever abandon or neglect you." And reading this article, I realized that this specific quote really correlates with everything else, with, having passive aggressiveness as you grow older, due that you were taught that by suppressing your feelings and by expressing them differently, by just being a little bit aggressive when you speak to someone, that would be better than fully on just letting the emotions happen. Another thing that I read when I was reading this article, which is really interesting, is that when a child who had trauma and now is an adult, they now have this different type of thinking called victimhood thinking, which basically they'll think themselves as a victims all the time, when they should think of them as themselves as survivors, because they survived something so traumatic to them, and that should build their character. But instead they think they're victims, and since they always are so used to being victims, they will make decisions off their trauma. So instead of being able to say no, they'll say yes to everything, even if they don't like it, which causes them to just never be able to be fulfilled with themselves and always feel like they should be the victim, and really they are the survivors. We will now be discussing the interactive activity that I would think will fully fit both the social and emotional development portion of this project. As I mentioned, my project is based on trauma in childhood growth. So in this activity, it's going to be called Emotions Jenga. This Emotions Jenga is going to be able to help individuals express how they feel and put them in a situation where they're able to talk with other individuals, and it's going to be a lot more better for them as they grow up because they're going to know how to communicate with others and not feel judged. Furthermore, explaining Emotions Jenga, basically this game's going to be stacked up like a normal Jenga game, which is 3 vertical and then 3 horizontal, but instead of just being regular brown blocks, they're going to be painted different colors, and every single color is going to be different emotions like sadness, happiness, anger, etc. And every single color will, like mentioned, will have the different emotions. So when you are getting one block, it's going to say the emotion. You will read it out loud and describe what that emotion is. Later, the individual is going to explain a time that they felt that way about that emotion. By doing this, this is really going to help individuals be able to express their feelings, which is something that children with trauma really struggle with because, as mentioned before, one of the reasons why trauma could even start is because their parents tell them that their feelings are not acceptable when really they are. By doing this activity, they'll be able to speak to other individuals, and they'll be able to finally be heard, which is something that could really help them and change their lives. And that will conclude the rest of this project over trauma and childhood growth, including the activity. Thank you so much for listening.